Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 13th of December 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And joining me today is Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches. Welcome to the programme, Alex.
Thanks, Mike. Very snowy on the ground here in Holland, and I gather it is in most parts of Britain as well, so we've got a bit of an early winter snap here.
Okay, well, apologies first of all for the technical issue that prevented us broadcasting yesterday. We were intending to have Dr. Graham Downing on with us. He'll join us with David Scott on Friday. Now, so Alex, thanks for coming. We're going to start off with, with Devon and Cornwall Police, because apparently the best thing to do is to patrol key locations, they're saying, and events over the festive period and the New Year with the support from armed officers. So officers will be visibly carrying long armed weapons, i.e. machine guns, to help offer further security and reassurance during this busy time of the year, as well as having support from our dog unit. So this is the head of Alliance Operations, Chief Superintendent Jim Nye, said, "I want to reassure the public there's no increase in the threat level, nor is this in reaction to any specific threat within Devon, Cornwall and Dorset." Because, Alex, these are the hubs of terrorist activity in the United Kingdom, and we need to have armed police on the streets at this festive season to make sure that everybody has the maximum festive spirit possible.
Well, it's a bit odd, Mike, I have to say. I mean, allegedly, this massive terrorist threat comes from certain Muslim and Asian communities, which are notably thin on the ground in the West Country. For our foreign viewers, we're talking about this Southwest Peninsula, deep into it as well, the bottom of that Southwest Peninsula of Britain, which is known for being very white and largely middle class and rural. So I really don't see what the threat is. Someone in the chat box is suggesting that Santa is now an SAS soldier. That's not really far wide of the mark, I'm afraid, these days. You know, we're having people saying that a lot of children will never be able to get to see a Santa in a grotto without him being flanked by policemen with rifles and carbines.
It's a sad indictment of modern British society, I think. Right, let's get on to more serious issues. Now, on Monday, the European Council ratified Permanent Structured Cooperation on EU Military Unification, that's PESCO, with now 25 member states participating. If you remember, the 23 member states signed the initial declaration, and they have now been joined by Ireland and by Portugal. And Alex, this issue of Ireland joining PESCO is pretty controversial. A number of things have been going on in Ireland, and the angst within the political community in Ireland is ramping up over this, because the government in Ireland didn't give Irish MPs too much opportunity to discuss this. In fact, they gave them a whole 24 hours notice that Ireland was going to join. There is an Act of Parliament in Ireland which requires a vote in the Dáil for this approval to be given. But one TD that I have seen commenting on this has said that in fact in 2009 there was a constitutional change in Ireland which should have prevented Ireland joining PESCO. So the situation in Ireland getting quite heated. There was a vote and there was a majority which passed it, which means Ireland has now joined. But it looks like potentially Ireland is looking at this as becoming a bit of a constitutional crisis.
A very severe one, Mike. Ireland has got a complicated constitutional history, and it embodies in microcosm how the European Union has ridden roughshod over countries' constitutions. Ireland has a common law constitution together with Britain and to some extent Malta as the English-speaking countries in the Union. And since it became a republic in 1949, although it already had a constitution before then, Bunreacht na hÉireann, it has always sought to chart a course of neutrality, not joining NATO, leaving the Commonwealth, and really being as neutral as Switzerland, Austria and Finland, although the latter two have also been dragged into the EU these days, and Finland and Sweden increasingly cooperate with NATO. So you've already got in Sweden an example of an EU country which is constitutionally neutral and unaligned, yet effectively in the EU NATO blob. Ireland is a more extreme case because of the sensitivities of the border, the troubles, the long struggle in Ireland for constitutional independence. And I think what the TD, the Cearta, the Irish MP, referred to in his reply to you there, is that this referendum because that's how constitutional changes are effected in Ireland. This constitutional change will probably have been a referendum run concomitantly with the Lisbon Treaty approval,
I
which of
believe
course
that's
took some
correct.
ramming through in
Yeah, I
Ireland.
think that's right.
Yes. So I think it's vaguely coming back to my mind now that the Irish electorate was told, join Lisbon, and the sop you'll get, or the reassurance, is that we'll enshrine, that's the verb that's usually used, and we'll enshrine Ireland's independence. Well, we see what a lot that counts for now. I mean, you can have what you like on paper, but he who pays the piper calls the tune, and Ireland is very much being told by the Franco-German bosses of the EU, you've transferred from British suzerainty to being our dog's body now.
Well, speaking of Franco-German suzerainty, let's have a look at this. This is from GermanForeignPolicy.com. So EU military unification now a reality as far as they're concerned?
Yes, people can freeze the screen and look at the most important bits, which I've put in red boxes, but this is a respected independent site, German-foreign-policy.com, which does a very good job of gisting in erudite English the papers. We've mentioned them before, papers coming out of the Bundeswehr, the armed forces, particularly these days the Bundesmarine, the German Navy, and geopolitical thinking in Germany. And in this case, they've never been proven wrong, by the way. We've had them on before talking about the corvettes, which the Baltic fleet of the German Navy has ordered. Here they're saying that Germany is becoming particularly the logistical hub together with the Netherlands. And they go into some detail about how this is actually a way of trying to get one up on the French, who've got their own reasons for trying to turn the EU into a military superpower these days. And Germany has got the greater mass, the economic might, and the better relations with Central and Western European countries. French military relations tend to be with East and Southern Europe. So Germany is trying to get one up on the French here under the scenes. But there's explicit mention in this document of, which is the latest document on GermanForeignPolicy.com, you'll find it easily, explicit mention of how Germany is seeking to supplant or at least roll NATO into the EU military arrangements. And
we'll come on to that in a second, Alex, but let's do this, because Monday was the issue of ratification of PESCO at the European Council. Yesterday at the European Council, this was an agreement on their position on the proposed regulation of European Parliament and the European Council establishing the European Defence Industrial Development Programme. And this is Jüri Luik, who's Minister of Defence for Estonia. Now, Estonia has the presidency of the European Council at the moment. He's saying European security is a core priority for our citizens. The European Defence Industrial Development Programme will make our defence industry more competitive and innovative. This is crucial. Really, this is another string to the bow of European Defence Union that we've been, and David Ellis in particular, has been trying to highlight for quite some time. The consolidation and of the defence industry throughout Europe. And we're seeing them press ahead with this policy agenda as well. And no coverage of it in the mainstream press, Alex.
No, if you put defence and industry together, most journalists go to sleep. But David Ellis, who was alone in saying this, absolutely alone a year ago, is again totally vindicated. The absolute hub of this has got to be tying the defence industries together so that nations do not have an independent future, even in terms of spinning off the many jobs and skills which defence industry creates. And you can see a whole list of David's contributions at ukcolumn.org/defence. But Jüri Luik is an interesting character. It's not the first time he's been Estonian defence minister. He had that role first in the government period of Mart Laar, who is really heroic, patriotic historian of Estonia, and under Toomas Ilves, the current president, who's much more about trying to manage Russia, he's been called back to that role. He has long experience with NATO and has been the ambassador to both the US and Canada. A serious guy, but I'm afraid with a lot of these patriotic Estonians, they confuse the determination that the Estonians have to manage communism, keep communism away so that they never have the horrors of that again, which they've suffered like no one else. They confuse that with Russia as an entity. Luik himself has a Russian, or had a Russian father, a famous oncologist in Estonia, although he doesn't share his surname. And I think that Luik has been identified as the kind of man who will, be a trusted go-between and smooth the Russians in all this. But it's going to end in tears. Much as I admire the Estonians and have esteem for their pretty much unique degree of suffering under Stalinism, it has to be said they have got this continual idea that the West is going to do their bidding and come to their rescue. So even the best of the Estonians have to be regarded warily in this. Okay, well, if that's what's been going on at the European Council the last couple of days, tomorrow, of course, is the big meeting, because that's the heads of government meeting. Theresa May will be at that, and whether she's there
with her head held high or with her head in her hands. That remains to be seen, depending on what happens in the House of Commons today, because there's going to be a vote on the Brexit, the Great Repeal Bill, and the Henry VIII powers, and she is looking at the possibility of a revolt from her own staff. Heads of government meeting tomorrow. Now, before we get onto that in detail, first of all, of course, we've got to say congratulations to Jens Stoltenberg. Here he is being congratulated by the ex-Tory Chief Whip, now Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson, yesterday, because he has had his term as Secretary General of NATO extended until 2020, till the 30th of September 2020. Gavin Williamson said, "I congratulate Jens Stoltenberg on the extension of his term as NATO Secretary General. He is a great friend and ally of the UK. NATO is the cornerstone of our defence, and the UK is a leading member of the alliance, one of just a handful of nations to meet the commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence." And so he went on. Now, the question in my mind is, why was Stoltenberg meeting Gavin Williamson yesterday? And of course, that is probably leading up to this European Council Heads of State meeting tomorrow, because for some reason, Alex, Jens Stoltenberg has been invited to that. We'll come on to that in a second. So he is attending that. Now, this is Heads of State and Government meeting. So does that mean that Jens Stoltenberg is the head of a state now? Is that what NATO is becoming? This is an interesting question. But Jens Stoltenberg had this to say about European defence, because this is why he's going. European defence, once again, is the main agenda item on the European Council meeting tomorrow. And Jens Stoltenberg will attend. And the point he's making at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum here is cooperation, not duplication. This is with regards to the joint operations between NATO and the EU. He is making the statement quite clearly that there will be no duplication of effort, that European military unification will act in cooperation with NATO and won't duplicate its function. So he has made this statement in an interview with the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum over the last couple of days. He is going to be there attending the European Council meeting tomorrow. And in that interview, he says, "It is also essential that NATO and the European Union cooperate more closely. Duplication is a luxury we cannot afford. The EU and NATO are now implementing 42 concrete proposals to cooperate further." So, Alex, I've said this before, but it's a really important point that anybody that is sceptical about EU military unification seems to miss, that most of the countries that have joined under PESCO to join this EU military structure are already members of NATO. And NATO is not having this cooperation discussion with those as individual nations. NATO is having discussions with the EU as a separate body and a separate organisation with its own military. And that has to be the point that people are getting. When Britain says that NATO is the key sort of mechanism for international operations of the British military, as NATO and the EU are merged, then it sort of becomes a moot point as to which organisation we're actually cooperating with.
It's an entirely academic question in the end, Mike, because Britain in particular has got fewer and fewer units to deploy. I see the latest is we've sent an RAF unit alongside the Albanians in some kind of defence exercise. But you know, the same chaps with the same cap badges are going to be doing the work. I think that applies to all of the EU and NATO member states, with the possible exception of France and Germany, which maybe still have the bulk of infantry and artillery, that they can choose what to send where. But for the rest, it's an entirely moot point, as you say. But again, it's Berlin where Mr. Stoltenberg has said this, and it's as the German foreign policy summary indicates, this is at the moment a swing of the German state, the German apparatus, because once you have a unified armed force, you want to throw it against something, at least defensively, if not aggressively. And for the French, that is, as it has been since the loss of the empire with Dien Bien Phu and Suez going the wrong way. For the French, it's always been the idea of Eurabia, a Mediterranean Europe with France in control and the naval aspects, and that's why they're interested in the Balkans and Cyprus and Egypt these days. For the Germans, it's the old competition between the German elite not the people, but the German elite and the Russian elite, as to who gets to control the manpower and the resources of the limited sovereignty countries in that horrible buffer zone in between. Horrible in the sense of fate is against them when Germany and Russia turn against them. Germany at the moment is saying, we will have this lot. And the two Western European countries that suffered the most from the last German occupation are Norway and the Netherlands. Okay, they provided a lot of SS fighters. That's an unfortunate truth. But they starved to death. They died in slash and burn policies and in torture and in forced labour. This is within living memory, that people were refugees in their own countries in Norway and the Netherlands. And now we have them leading the charge with the Germans. It's very odd.
Okay, well, something else which has been going on, of course, is NATO expansion. So a series of declassified documents have been published by the National Security Archive. This is George Washington University. And these were published yesterday. It's called NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard. Now, according to these documents, US Secretary of State James Baker's famous "not 1 inch eastward" assurance about NATO expansion in his meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990, in February 1990, was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and 1991. And it goes on to say that the first concrete assurances by Western leaders on NATO began on January 31st, 1990, when West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher opened the bidding with a major public speech in Tutzing in Bavaria on German unification. And it goes on to say that the US Embassy in Bonn informed Washington by cable that Genscher made clear that changes in Eastern Europe and the German unification process must not lead to an impairment of Soviet security interests. Therefore, NATO should rule out an expansion of its territory towards the east, i.e. moving it closer to the Soviet borders. And that cable also noted that Genscher's proposal to leave East German territory out of NATO military structures, even in a unified Germany in NATO. And this became known as the Tutzing formula, and it immediately became the centre of a flurry of important diplomatic discussions over the next 10 days in 1990, leading to the crucial February the 10th, 1990 meeting in Moscow between Chancellor Kohl and Gorbachev, when the West German leader achieved Soviet assent in principle to German unification in NATO, as long as NATO did not expand to the east. They only waited a couple of decades, and away they continued with their plans. Alex, it's interesting that this has been released at this time, and it's an interesting little piece of history. And anybody, what can you say about it? NATO has expanded to the east, and the Soviet Union may have disappeared, but the Russians cannot feel any less upset about it, nonetheless.
Russo-German or Soviet-German relations are the absolute linchpin of all 20th century geopolitics, and from the late 19th onwards. And all the flim-flam about Anglo-French relations, Anglo-American tussles, is all second fiddle to that. And geopolitics is so arranged that we are not given in English the stuff that's written in German and Russian about these relationships. They're very personal. For example, Mrs. Kohl committed suicide, not well known. Mr. Kohl's just died recently, but he was a widower for many years because his wife committed suicide because of the delayed trauma of having been raped by Red Army soldiers in 1945, I think it was, in eastern Germany. And she could never bear to hear Gorbachev speak on the phone to her husband because she couldn't bear the sound of Russian anymore. This predisposed Kohl to be a kind of suppliant to the Soviets, but he had to butter up Thatcher and Reagan to get unification through. What's been released there is new, but the likes of Dr. Eric Zeus, whom we had on our special Insight episode on Eurasia, Zeus and others have intimated this knowledge of this in advance because, as Zeus pointed out, Gorbachev was told by Baker, acting on behalf of George H.W. Bush, that we will never move an inch eastwards, but he could not get it on paper. And as Zeus says, the Soviets' mistake in the dying days of the USSR was to assume they were dealing with gentlemen, whereas in fact they were dealing with, he doesn't use the word, but these are in fact Luciferians who wish to destroy Russia as the last bastion of what you want to call European Christendom or patriotism, and to take over so that there will be a single world banking system and effectively an end to nations. Because people weren't aware in those days of just how evil George H.W. Bush was. I don't think Baker was quite that evil. People didn't really assume that. But this is all coming out now, as you say.
One other thing that did grab my attention in this was, and I'll quote again here, it says, the French leader, François Mitterrand, was not in a mind meld with the Americans, quite the contrary, as evidenced by his telling Gorbachev in Moscow on May the 25th, 1990, that he was, quotes, personally in favour of gradually dismantling the military blocs. But he continued the cascade of assurances, this says, by saying, the West must create security conditions for you as well as European security as a whole. So we get a hint that EU military unification or European military unification was on their minds even back in 1990.
Yes, indeed, and we are going to move our timeline backwards to cover more of the 1940s, 50s and 60s, the European Union military unification timeline, which is on the front page of UK column, but it has been in play all these times. It was the French that resisted it in the mid-50s because they were still thinking that they could lead some other format and preserve nominal national sovereignty and prestige. The British and the Americans were pushing towards this for decades and telling their client state, the Germans, what to do. And for a long time, it was the Soviet Union that was seeing the writing on the wall and holding this back. So that's why another one of the reasons why 1990 was such a crucial, pivotal moment in geopolitics. I mean, I visited just after 1990, in fact, the border area, Thüringen, and I was given a piece of the barbed wire from the frontier. But the interesting thing was it had been snapped up immediately. And as soon as you crossed the border in 91, 92, they had made every effort, particularly on the eastern side, to dismantle all these, everything but the pillboxes, basically, that couldn't be uprooted, dismantle the barbed wire and the installations. You couldn't see when you were passing the former border. But having gone back more recently, I was struck by the fact that the older people were reminiscent of, at least in the old days, we had protection from the Soviets. They're kind of obsessed with military and security, particularly in Eastern Germany. And you can understand why. But it's been latent in the population all this time. They have a sense that they don't want to be the front line anymore. They want to push that front line eastwards. So in a sense, even the population and the trauma that the people have gone through has kind of had a knock-on effect into politics and has given the Germans a sense of we must push eastwards. I noticed that Angela Merkel made this point to President Trump recently and said the Germans don't want to pay any more for the military. They wouldn't be happy with it. And for once, I think I would agree with Trump's response. He said, Angela, baby, you have to understand that the Americans are not happy footing the bill as it is. There is a financial aspect to all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so, well, let's come back to the UK then. Excuse me. And, well, the government has published a new job. You can apply for it if you wish. It's for wargame designer and analyst. The closing date for applications is the 14th of January 2018. The pay grade is between 24,000 and 35,000, and you're going to be based at the DSTL. The job description asks, do you love designing or participating in wargames? Do you have experience in developing unconventional ideas which inspire people to think differently? Do you want to work in a dynamic, fast-paced environment which will challenge you to adapt to intellectual challenges throughout your working day? And they say you will assist in the design and development of wargames, translating customer requirements into practicable designs based on credible overarching scenarios and vignettes. Find ways to improve and exploit existing wargame systems, evaluating them for suitability and applicability in order to explore, test, inform the customer's key requirements and so on. And they're looking for someone who can find ways to improve and adapt elements of existing commercial hobby game rule sets to meet requirements and deliver creative and engaging wargames or design and innovate game mechanics from scratch. Alex, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, war games have a long history in the British and American Ministries of Defence, and in this case, it's an appendage of the MOD called DSTL, significantly at their Fareham site, which is near Portsmouth, supposedly our main naval dockyard. There has been a long history of it, but wargaming is a very good cover for actual war plans. Because you can say it's just a scenario, isn't it? For example, War Plan Red in the 1930s, when, just as on the eve of the First World War, in fact, the American elite was thinking, can we topple the British Empire? And in both cases, they held back and thought, actually, no, the Germans are doing that just fine for us. And the same is going on now, but with the Russians in play, I think. And at the back of this is someone's planning for Europe to be knocked out, for which see our Joel Skousen interview, Europe to be knocked out and have its economy taken over by a Eurasian blob, which may in fact be more deserving than what's left of the Anglo-Zionist blob. But it's a well thought out way of planning advanced scenarios in which continental players in the good old British tradition are got to nudge and to start something off. And of course, the knack in this is to try to get away with it, because if you can have it pinned on you that you started a third world war, Russia will be utterly ruthless because its survival is at stake. And I'm afraid all this ends up with something a lot more serious than games. It ends up with nuclear bombs. And we can only hope that if it gets that far, it will be on remote military targets. There's some suggestion, in fact, that the London establishment already suspects, or some of the elite players in it who are in the cabals, they know that that's the likely outcome if they keep prodding. And that may be why they've moved all the naval and nuclear things up to Faslan, because who cares about Scotland getting nuked?
Yes, well, I mean, but the question in my mind was when you would have expected a wargaming scenario, somebody that's working in this area, for it to be quite a serious thing. And I was particularly struck by this. We are looking for someone who can help find ways to improve and adapt elements of existing commercial hobby game rule sets to meet requirements. I mean, is this something that is common for the defence planning to be based on hobby game rules?
No, there has been a recent tradition for GCHQ to take some of its code crackers from the gaming and hacking world. And NSA's done that for longer. It's kind of taking the black hat off a hacker and putting him on the good team, as it were. But the military, and particularly wargaming, always used to be done by mustachioed colonels and air commodores and the like, with quite some reserve behind them. But the profile and the salary for this job, and the mention of talking to commercial gaming, suggests they want someone in their mid-20s, if not younger. And that is really very dangerous, because then the person is putty in your hands and has usually quite a naive view of the world and will swallow the idea that the Russians are evil and out to get us. So effectively, you'll be a toy in the hands of some think tank or cabal.
Indeed. I think that was my concern as well. So thanks for that, Alex. Now let's move on to corruption. We're going to start off with Jean-Claude Juncker, who is in the Express today. He's been dragged into, as they say, a perjury and phone tapping scandal. The president of the European Commission faces accusations that his officials gave inaccurate information under oath during an investigation involving an alleged wiretap more than 10 years ago when Mr. Juncker was Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Last Monday, investigating Judge Eric Schamo began an inquiry into whether officials working for Mr. Juncker falsified key evidence for a parliamentary and then judicial investigation in 2012 and 2013. I would have thought, Alex, that there's a few people probably with their knives out for Jean-Claude Juncker, and maybe this is an opportunity to see the back of him. Yes,
well, he has enough skeletons in his closet, and as well as having the nickname Drunker and being begrudged by many because of the slapstick comedy that he makes out of his role. There's other people with more serious knives out for him. This, if I'm not mistaken, is the scandal known in the French-speaking press as LuxLeaks, which has never become very well known in Britain, or it's a spillover from that. But it points out how in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, as in many of the smaller European jurisdictions, including Belgium, which, like Luxembourg, has the headquarters of EU and NATO institutions in it, these countries actually have pure Napoleonic law with very few safeguards and a great deal of power in the hands of the main players. And Juncker basically ran Luxembourg as a fiefdom for nearly 2 decades. His family has got some questions to answer about Nazi loot, and Luxembourg as a state, under his tenure as well as before it, has questions to answer about whether they allowed the Germans to cut through by some special deal in both wars on the promise that they would be incorporated into the Reich and not suffer too much damage because they are German speakers. So there's a very dirty mess in Luxembourg. It's one of these countries where you just sense on the streets that the police could lock you away and do anything they want to you, a bit like Switzerland in that regard. They're the countries that claim to have the highest and standards of anti-corruption in the world, but very few safeguards, nothing like the common law checks and balances. So Juncker has got a lot of dirt on him, and he was, of course, boss of intelligence in his role as well, but or had the thumbscrews over intelligence. But of course, he's had to forsake that role to move to Brussels. So he's left his secrets behind, and perhaps even a card index. Who knows?
Yeah, indeed. Well, we don't need to worry about corruption because the British government's doing everything about it. Of course, it's run conferences on it in the last 2 years. It's setting up global strategies on corruption. It's now set out the latest aspect of its anti-corruption strategy. They're making the point that £90 billion of criminal money is laundered through the City of London every year. That's according to the National Crime Agency. And so they are now setting up a new National Economic Crime Centre, and that's going to sit within the National Crime Agency. It's going to include representatives from City of London Police, the Serious Fraud Office and the Financial Conduct Authority, the Home Office, the Crown Prosecution Service and HM Revenue and Customs. Their priorities are reducing the insider threat in high-risk domestic sectors such as borders and ports, reducing corruption in public procurement and grants, promoting integrity across public and private sectors, and strengthening the integrity of the UK as an international financial centre. They're also going to improve the business environment globally, apparently, and they're working with other countries to combat corruption. And so on top of this new organisation, Theresa May has announced the appointment of John Penrose MP as a new anti-corruption champion. So that's fantastic news. We're going to go all anti-corruption here at the UK. Let's watch and wait as the City of London is cleaned up by this new body, the new National Economic Crime Centre. I'm looking forward to that. And in the meantime, well, The Guardian and the Bureau for Investigative Journalism have been trying to highlight the issue of corporate spying, and they're saying quite clearly, The Guardian at least is saying quite clearly, that big corporates are paying ex-spies, ex-special forces people to infiltrate campaign groups. I would imagine the fracking group, the anti-fracking groups, for example, are a key part of that. Well, this investigation is entitled on the Bureau of Investigative Journalism website, is entitled Inside the Corporate Investigation Business. They say the corporate investigations industry is by its very nature a secretive business, but has recently and reluctantly come out of the shadows. Last year, a private spy, Christopher Steele. Alex, I'm not entirely certain whether Christopher Steele is a private spy. Does anybody actually ever leave MI6?
Well, I had dealings with the chap, and I don't think he's of the kind who would ever leave the club, or as the CIA call it, the firm. He's one of those who has the connections and the nefariousness to carry on with it to the grave, I'm afraid. Okay,
so they say last year a private spy, Christopher Steele, was forced to flee his home following a leak of a dossier it compiled on President Donald Trump. The former MI6 Russia hand had started his own security firm, Orbis Intelligence, and had compiled an account of collusion between the Kremlin and Trump's presidential campaign. I think that's still an alleged account anyway. Trump has repeatedly denied any such collusion. Steele, for his part, has recently reported as saying that he believed 70 to 90% of what was in the dossier was accurate. And so it goes on. Now, some of the companies, they say, even have private military arms, a legacy of Hoover up contracts in post-invasion Iraq or protecting shipping against Somali pirate gangs. Others still have veterans of the nervous 90s in Russia, where blue chip businesses vied with mafia gangs for control of vast swathes of natural resources. It's an industry which could be said quite literally to have skeletons in its closet. Well, I think there's a lot more to come out on this, but where's the line to be drawn in this, Alex? And is this simply a massive privatization of the security services?
That, I think, is the profoundest element of it. Just like the police and, in fact, the military are being lined up for privatization by the same people who stand to profit ideologically and financially from that arrangement. But there's also an aspect of the security services and agencies in all the English-speaking countries, much like the continent, but it's their own network, the English-speaking ones. They have been out of control and had very little congressional and parliamentary oversight for decades. The US Congress started addressing this in the 70s in the case of NSA, and since about 2000, largely I have to say to credit the old Labour figures for this, there's been more oversight in Britain. But the old networks, particularly the Satanists in the outfit, have never really accepted that. And it's, as Brian Gerry said on a recent show, it's the element of black ops, that these guys go off seamlessly into the nasty companies looting the world for London and New York-based companies, much as Gordon Bowden's network has found the details of.
Okay, now I want to highlight this. This is Press TV. I don't like a lot of what Press TV does these days, but I think this particular report on Ms. Zaghari Ratcliffe, the British Iranian who is in prison in Iran, allegedly for attempting to undermine the Iranian government. This particular report, I think, is really very, very good. Now, we've been doing quite a lot of research, background research on this, and I have to say that I haven't, based on the research that we've done, I haven't found anything that I can really criticise in this report, so I do recommend people find it on Press TV. The headline is UK's Soft War Against Iran, Case of Zaghari, and watch it, and we'll maybe get to comment on that a bit more in the not too distant future. But the other thing I just wanted to highlight was that if you attempt to search for this on Twitter, people are reporting, because this is clearly being shared quite a lot on Twitter at the moment, but people are reporting that if you try to search Twitter for the tweets that people are making on this, there's nothing to be found, and that certainly seems to be the case when I went looking for it earlier on today. So quite an interesting thing. Have you got any thoughts just briefly on this case, Alex? I mean, the issue of BBC Media Action and these types of organisations and their activities in countries, that is absolutely clear. I don't know what her involvement was, but nonetheless, there are questions to be answered with the entire approach Britain takes with this aspect of so-called soft power.
Well, to keep it as brief as possible, Mike, I would say that we in the English-speaking world have gone to a model of civic nationhood, which basically talks about values and soft power and the like. The parts of the world where things are quite hard-nosed, in the middle of Eurasia, where you've got real enemies all around you, haven't ever been able to afford that. So they see anyone, even ethnic networks, as a threat. They're masters of propaganda. And Russia and Iran have spent the whole 20th century, with good reason, talking about Britain as perfidious Albion, like the French and the other continentals used to call us. And they do see plots around every corner in Central Asia. But, having left GCHQ, yes, someone in the chat room is saying, did Alex really leave GCHQ? Yes, I did, and I've been shunned by my old colleagues there. Having left it, I see more clearly that there are real interests, not so much in the agencies and the BBC themselves, but in the corporate networks behind that, and that they really do poke a finger at Russia and Iran and the like by questioning the fabric of their social order and their religious order and their values and their political systems, and particularly doing that through propaganda and broadcasting. So these countries are quite within their rights to regard, as Britain itself used to do, regard such efforts against them as subversion.
Yes. Okay, now, complete change of subject here. Alex, you're asking, why does Britain favour stranger adoption? This is an article in The Guardian. The headline is adoption and fostering are not the only option. It's time to invest in kinship care. My question to you, Alex, would be, does Britain favour stranger adoption because that has been turned into an industry?
Yes, in a word. I think it's beyond doubt now. There are particular black spots in the country, but Louise Tickle's article in The Guardian and the follow-up letters have been quite interesting. We'll just perhaps put them on screen very quickly, no time to read them out. People can freeze them, but as you can see, a range of respectable people, professors and the like, saying, thank goodness this has been raised. The statistics about this are that I think Spain is in the lead with nearly half of children who are adopted going to kinship carers, so that's aunts, uncles, whatever. The figure for Britain is 9%, if I've got my figures right. I think that's the last time I checked. As usual, we are in the minority and at the bottom of the table, and we continue to be, with very few exceptions. I think Croatia is another, very few exceptions. The only country in the world, more or less, which forces children to be adopted against their parents' will. And it's very questionable whether that is a good policy. Okay, now you wanted to raise the case of Eugene Lukyanenko. What's this all about? Eugene Lukyanenko is easily found on Facebook, or his campaign is, and you can see him campaigning here and asking for his son. If I am not wrong, then the only reason why the local council, which is Medway, which is a Kent council, the only reason they ever submitted that he was an unfit father for his son was that his own father had been a Holocaust victim. It's pretty incredible that it was the risk of future emotional harm nonsense, which doesn't have a basis in law, but councils get away with it.
Sorry, can I just just to understand what you're saying here? This man's father was a Holocaust victim, and the local child protection services are attempting to say that because his father was a Holocaust victim, that he may then cause emotional harm to his child. Is that really
Correct.
what they're saying?
Yes, I've not seen anything to the contrary by Medway Council. That is what they're saying, that because before Mr. Lukyanenko's own birth, Lukyanenko Sr. was a victim of anti-Semitic prejudice, therefore, and that's it. It's ringed there by me. Therefore, he's going to be have his own son taken away for the risk of future emotional harm. And the Medway Council's case against him says that the son, who was named, we're not going to do that, there's some kind of injunction out, the son has difficulties, this was Mr. Lukyanenko's shocking crime, that his son has difficulties being able to say, talk or highlight, very ungrammatical there, anything negative about Mr. Lukyanenko. So that is the gold standard for good parenting in Britain, is that your children criticize you. And if they don't criticize you, there must be something wrong and you have to be put up for profitable stranger adoption. Eugene Lukyanenko is a Jewish man born in Ukraine, and he has Dutch citizenship. The Netherlands government here doesn't seem to have done much about it, but his citizenship is Dutch. He lives in the Medway, Kent area. He's now in prison since a committal hearing at Canterbury Combined Court on the 24th of November for the crime of breaching the injunction because he named his son, I think in Cyrillic script only, but it was decipherable to people who read Russian. And by saying happy birthday, he'd also revealed the young man's date of birth. But here is the lady who has been in charge of the case, Anne Domeney. We have instincts for a reason, and if your gut tells you that this is not a good woman, there's probably a reason for that. And on the right is her AD Children's Services Limited, now in liquidation and failed to file accounts, apparently. But this could indicate nefariousness. It could just be that this is the way in which she bills for her so-called advisory services to the council on adoption and care cases. But it does not look good, does it?
No. Now the two MPs his MP is Remen Chishti. And also on the left there, we've got Ian Sutherland, who's Medway Director of Children and Adult Services, who is quoted here as saying, "Your son will never come back home."
Yes, that is what he's been quoted as saying on the Eugene Lukyanenko support page.
So, I mean, you've got to ask what kind of person makes a statement like that?
Someone who's in it for the money and the prestige, I think, and not for any care for children. I've got very little time left for such people, I have to say. Lukyanenko, by the way, is also known by his stage name, Yevgeny Soifertis, Soifertis. That's the name under which he's a professional concert pianist. You can find him on YouTube playing some beautiful Glinka piano music. And another man we should mention in this regard is the deputy governor of the Kent prison where he's now being held. These details are on screen in a moment, but the deputy governor is called Mr. Andrew, I'm sorry, I'm just looking for it here. Andrew Davey, D-A-V-Y. And Mr. Andrew Davey has either been misinformed himself or misled his supporters, because he has said that Mr. Lukyanenko came off his hunger strike, but apparently the truth of it is he's been on hunger strike with 1 day's intermission for 20 days now. Right,
okay. So if anybody wants to contact Eugene Lukyanenko, these are the details. You can freeze the screen, and we'll put this in the show notes under the videos wherever they are on UK Column or on YouTube. But
so the key details are that his prisoner number is there, is it 6309EC, right. And he's at Elmley Prison, Elmley Prison on the Isle of Sheppey. And he said before he was committed to jail for this supposed breach that he would go on hunger strike, not in protest against the sentence, but because of his original demand that there was nothing he'd done which should alienate him from his son. His own parents, or rather his father at least, the Holocaust survivor, lives in Israel with his partner, and there is very limited contact between Mr. Lukyanenko and his father, and none between grandfather and grandson.
Okay, well, we'll keep people up to date with that. Now, of course, his MP not doing anything for him, Melanie Shaw's MP not doing anything for her. This seems to be a thread which runs through a lot of cases that we come across. So perhaps it's not unsurprising that MPs have been receiving not terribly pleasant messages. And this is a report out today from the committee, the Independent Committee on Standards in Public Life. And the report is, as you can see there, called Intimidation in Public Life, a review by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And they say, first of all, I'll quote Lord Bew, who's chair of the committee. He said this level of vile and threatening behaviour, albeit by a minority of people against those standing for public office, is unacceptable in a healthy democracy. We cannot get to a point where people are put off standing, retreat from debate, and even fear for their lives as a result of their engagement in politics. And of course, this review was set up following alleged abusive comments being made on social media during the most recent general election campaign. Lord Bew goes on to say, this is not about protecting elites or stifling debate. It's about ensuring we have a vigorous democracy in which participants engage in a responsible way, which recognises others' rights to participate and to hold different points of view. The committee advises the Prime Minister on standards of conduct across public life, and it's made a package of what they describe as a package of recommendations to address these threats and intimidation experienced by parliamentary candidates and others. And so they're recommending that government should bring forward legislation to shift the liability of illegal content online towards social media companies. And Alex, I find this is, I'll go through the other points that they make in a second, but this first one, that government should bring forward legislation to shift the liability of illegal content online towards social media companies. Alex, this is unbelievable, because the social media companies have not committed any offence. If I commit libel or slander, or if I am abusive to somebody online, that's me that has committed that offence. It's not Twitter, it's not Facebook. And so what the government is attempting to do here, or what this recommendation is attempting to do here, is to put more pressure on social media companies to censor activity on their platforms. There are already laws in place. This is just like Leveson in many ways. There are already laws in place to deal with abusive behaviour or harassment. You do not need to shift the liability onto an organisation that hasn't generated the content in the first place.
Yes, at the root of this is the definition of intimidation, and also the definition of publication. It's a real stretch, whichever jurisdiction you're in, to say that a social media company has published someone's material by giving them the facility to write their own opinion unedited on it. That is a real blackmail tactic, and we are told by the Silicon Valley people that the reason no one in the world, not even the US, can have First Amendment protections for their speech is because these platforms supposedly operate seamlessly across the globe with no jurisdictional boundaries, and because Germany has thrown its weight around as usual with its government's intimidatory tactics that are standard. And Heiko Maas, the Interior Minister, has said, we have these defamation demands in place, and we will hold you responsible as the publishers company, this is the tech companies, and fine you upwards of 50 million euros a day that you don't take the stuff down. And because of that, Silicon Valley has of course bowed, possibly willingly, because they don't like free speech either, and has treated the whole world as the same jurisdiction as Germany or the EU. So that's at the root of this.
So the next recommendation is that social media companies must ensure that they're able to make decisions quickly and consistently on the takedown of intimidatory content online. They say that the government should consult on the introduction of a new offence in electoral law of intimidating parliamentary candidates and party campaigners. They say that the political parties must work together to develop a joint code of conduct on intimidatory behaviour during election campaigns by December 2018. The code should be jointly enforced by the political parties. And finally, they said that the National Police Chiefs Council should ensure that local police forces have sufficient training to enable them to effectively investigate offences committed through social media. And I think that last one is probably the only one that is reasonable, because it should be something that the police investigate and bring criminal charges if a criminal offence has been taken place. But putting this on social media companies that are already taking it upon themselves to censor free speech, this is giving them additional powers, which I think they have no entitlement to.
Correct, and it's also setting up a political caste above us. The common law doesn't recognise parties anyway, but they exist de facto, and now they're being enshrined in statute as a cut above the rest of us by having a special victim category for party workers. These are people with no elected office at all, but party workers apparently have special protections, and not just for a real offence, but for the impossible to prove offence of intimidation, because you cannot prove mens rea, the intention to do the act, with intimidation. It's in the eye of the offended person, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, look, unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we've got to leave it there. Alex, for today, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you'll be with me again tomorrow. But thank you for joining us as well. We will be back at 1 p.m. As usual tomorrow, and we hope to see you then. Thank you. Bye-bye.